Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink. It is time for some PathOfExile 2 discussion. Welcome to day 13 of Teaser season. Today has been a very quiet day from grinding gear games themselves. But don't worry about that, there's been a whole lot of things I haven't been able to cover on this channel yet because there's just so much in the way of little disparate teasers that have been scattered to the winds. Today, we're going to catch up on all of those. The only thing that's come out today so far, the time I'm recording this video, about 8 days and 16 hours before the start of early access, is Hoghunt. This is one of the most ridiculously OP pieces of leveling gear I've ever seen. This is something that is going to be completely off the charts broken if you happen to get it at level 1 or 2, and it's going to be completely mediocre and forgotten by the time you reach level 20 or 30. So Hoghunt has a bunch of physical damage that is completely unbelievable for low level. It has really high critical strike chance, and it has a fairly low attacks per second. And then it has a little bonus of maiming on critical hit. Essentially, if you get this, I think Act 1 is going to be on easy mode. And then Act 2, 3, and so on, you're just going to want to replace it. Main purpose of this is going to be to hand down to your second character of a league, where I think it will be really good. All of this, of course, assumes that it was intentional, that it was put out with no minimum level, or minimum level of 1. If it is intended to have a minimum level of 10 or so, then at that point, it's just something you use from 10 until you outlevel it. The next thing I want to discuss is an earlier teaser that we didn't really have a chance to do a deep dive into at all, and to the best of my knowledge, pretty much no one has been talking about. This is the way essences are going to be working in PathOfExile 2. Now, this was touched upon in the main live stream reveal, and they gave a couple of examples of it. What I want to do is go through some of the known essences and also discuss some of the strategies you'll have with them. Essence of the Body upgrades a normal item to magic, so it effectively replaces a transmutation orb, and it will have 1 life modifier. Now, in many cases, this is just going to be maximum life, but there may also be other mods that it can roll. For example, on a martial weapon, you might get life leech, and who knows what you get if you were to use this on a scepter. This is going to be a very basic starting point for further crafting. You're going to use this in lieu of a transmutation orb. If you're happy with the result, then you continue further. You're going to then apply an augmentation orb in order to get it up to 2 mods. Then you could use a regal orb and exalt the item out. Of course, if you end up disappointed with the results at any point, you just stop, you don't invest anything more into it. Now, one of the things that's really important with essences, there is going to be no analog of the Scouring Orb in PathOfExile 2. What this means is that you can only ever once use an essence on a given base. So this is going to mean that if essence crafting is better than I think it will be at Endgame, then in that case, people are going to want scoured bases quite a bit. All that said, I don't think that essence crafting is going to be particularly powerful at Endgame. Where this is going to shine is earlier on, when you want to solve a particular urgent problem with your build. You realize, oh, my character is not really working very well because of X. Well, I'm going to fix X, and I'm going to do it through the use of essences and just items that I find on the ground. However, if you are wanting to get essences to work a little bit later in the game, so perhaps early into endgame and maybe even into middle maps or middle waystones as they're called now, you're probably going to want to look for greater essences. These will function as a regal orb, where a normal essence functions as a transmutation orb, but it's going to be a directed regal orb. Ultimately, greater essence of the body is going to be a way, if you've got 2 solid mods on an item, whether one of them came from an essence or whether they both came from other means, greater essence of the body is going to be a way that you can direct the next modifier onto it, and if you're still happy with the results, then perhaps you consider exalting the item out. And if you're ecstatic with the results, not just happy with them, then maybe you'll go as far as to use some of the omens that come out of Ritual, which are the spiritual successor to PathOfExile 1's metamods. More interesting though, perhaps, is the Essence of Haste. I think this is the best of the lot, and particularly the greater Essence of Haste. The ability to find a set of boots that don't have move speed on the ground, that's magic already, and that has 2 good mods you might want to use, and then just slap a greater Essence of Haste on it and hope the move speed roll is high. This is something that I can see people being pretty happy about. There's a number of other slots you might conceivably want a greater Essence of Haste as well. If it's like PathOfExile 1 and the gloves are a good slot to get attack speed, then maybe that's something you'd want to consider too. Essence of Ice is next, and this is going to upgrade a normal item to magic with 1 cold modifier, and then there's a greater Essence of Ice. This can be something that you might be able to use sometimes in order to guarantee cold resistance on an item. Even if you can't guarantee it though, it's going to have a pretty good chance of adding it, and that could be something that solves a little bit of a problem on your build early on. That, I think, is going to be the main purpose here, but who knows, Maybe we'll find out when we play around with the essences, maybe there's some way to make them a little bit better than they look at the moment. All in all, that's essences so far. I do think that these are going to be pretty good early on, but I also think they're going to fall off, just buried under the weight of some of the potentially really high power rare items that we'll be IDing off the ground. That might not have the perfect stats that we want, but will have a higher average level of stat, and as a result may end up being quite a bit better overall. Meat Shield Support is next, and this is something coming back from PathOfExile 1 with a little bit of a difference. Now, we need to talk about support requirements here. This is something that Catmaster OP reached out to me. He has had the lucky opportunity to play PathOfExile 2 over at a German games convention. And when he was there, he had a quick chat with Jonathan Rogers, and they clarified what these support requirements mean. Now, the way that I had interpreted this was that Meat Shield Support would be attached to a skill gem, and that skill gem's requirements would go up by 5 points of intelligence. No. What happens instead is that support gems as a whole across your character add up all of these support requirements, and your character needs to be able to meet them all in order to use your collection of support gems. This is important to note because it means you're going to need a bunch of stats, because you're going to want to eventually build up to have a whole lot of support gems, potentially a 5 or 6 link in every single slot that you've got on your character sheet, which is a lot of them. So, stat requirements, they could become quite oppressive in PathOfExile 2, and it might occasionally mean that if your character just happens to have a lot of dexterity on it, you might want to sometimes choose a green support gem that's not quite as good as some of the blue options, because those green ones end up being easier on your stat requirements. So essentially, this is a requirement that is added up across all support gems across your character. Or alternately, you can think of this another way. 1/5 of your dexterity, that's the number of green support gems your character can use across its entirety. As for what Meat Shield does, it's very simple. You want the minions that are supported to defend you rather than to hunt down your enemies, and so that's what they do. They gain the defensive trait, and they also will have a 10% chance to taunt when they hit. Taunting can be quite dangerous sometimes, and it's something that in PathOfExile 1 players can be pretty reticent to use. I think in PathOfExile 2 it'll be a little bit better than it is in PoE 1, and that's because in PoE 2 there'll be more telegraphing of some of the most deadly abilities from bosses, and so having a monster turn suddenly to fire at a zombie instead of at you will be less dangerous than it can be in PathOfExile 1, where that monster can then just hit you with a one-shot. The next thing to discuss is the Rhoa Mount. Now, this is something that will be available to some bow characters, and it is not a mount in the traditional MMO sense. It's not something that gives you a speed boost. What it does is it allows you to completely ignore movement penalties for firing ranged weapons. So this is not something that's going to function like a Diablo 4 mount does. It's not going to be something you're going to feel, oh, I've got to keep resummoning all the time. Instead, it's just something you can reserve 50 spirit on if you want this effect. And then when you're moving around, you'll be able to fire at full speed without having to slow your movement speed in order to keep firing. Faster casting is next. This is a straightforward stat support, but one that'll have a little bit of depth in thinking of whether you want to put this on something that is slow or whether you want to put this on something that's fast. Now with faster casting, I think you really need to factor in this is going to increase the mana drain. It's not actually directly increasing the mana cost of the skill, but it is going to mean that you're casting at 20% faster. Option 1 is to use this on a very slow, very impactful spell. They tend to have high mana costs, and if you're trying to spam one, you might find that you really struggle with mana. That's probably its best use if you can manage the mana demands, but if you can't, then you want to pick something else. You could also put this on something that is a very low cost skill, in which case you can spam it away. The other thing I want you to consider though is the option of using this on a big cooldown skill. Not because it will do anything to help with reducing that cooldown, but those big cooldown skills tend to be the most important spells to have go off absolutely reliably. And faster casting isn't just something that increases your damage output, it also increases your damage reliability. I want you to keep that in mind when you're deciding where faster casting goes on your character. This is a gem you're probably going to want to use. Enfeeble is next. This is a curse that you can use, and it's got some interesting text on it. Curses all enemies in an area after a short duration, causing them to deal less damage. So you have the curse duration is 8.4 seconds, but it's not clear what this short duration is. Whether this is something that takes half a second to tick in, whether it's something that takes 100 milliseconds, whether it's something that takes a full second or a second and a half to tick in. That's going to be what Enfeeble lives or dies based on. The curse radius is only 2 meters, which is going to feel very small to PathOfExile 1 players, and it's going to have a very high impact on rare enemies, 21% less damage, also for magic and normal, but for unique enemies, it's a bit nerfed, it's only 16% less damage. But that is like having 20% more hit points, because that's going to make you a lot tankier against some of those scary unique monsters that we're going to be finding. Remember, bosses in PathOfExile 2 are a bigger deal than they are in PathOfExile 1, and as a result, you're going to be wanting to be quite careful around them. Enfeeble might be the tool in order to do that. Glaciation Support is next. Now, there are two things that are going to modify freeze build-up. This is the better of the two. This has a cost multiplier of 120%, and supported skills cause 50% more freeze build-up. We still don't have the precise text of the way that ailments are going to work in PathOfExile 2. Fingers crossed grinding your games can get information on that organized quickly, but we shall see. Now we have Ice Bite and the very related Innervate support. These are going to provide you with a buff that is going to stay on your character for 5 seconds if you can meet a trigger condition with a certain skill. So Ice Bite needs to be on the skill that triggers this buff, but you don't need to be using that skill later in order to gain the benefits of the buff. Ice Bite's buff, attacks gain 20% of damage as extra cold damage for 5 seconds, and the trigger condition is that you freeze an enemy with the skill that is supported by Ice Bite. But note that the attack that gains the 20% of damage added as extra cold, that does not need to be supported by Ice Bite. That can be something else entirely. I think that this is going to be really strong as a result, and it's very thematically tied to the Monk's Invoker class. And I can see every single Monk Invoker that takes I Am the Blizzard using Ice Bite, and everyone that takes I Am the Thunder will take Innervate. Of course, if your Monk takes both, you're probably going to use both of these. Now, Innervate has a slightly different trigger condition. Its buff is similar. It's 20% of damage as extra lightning, also for 5 seconds. But the trigger condition here is killing a shocked enemy with supported skills, as opposed to successfully inflicting a freeze for Ice Bite. So two support gems here that are similar but slightly different. They're not really mirrors of each other, but they sort of are. Last Gasp support feels like it's something straight out of a horror movie, but it's also something you are definitely going to want on a lot of builds. So, ever seen a zombie that's taken absolutely fatal wounds? You know it's going to die, but it just hasn't died yet, and it gets a couple of last gasp attacks off? Well, that's exactly what this support gem is going to do. Minions from supported skills die 4 seconds after their life is reduced to 0. They get a 4-second last gasp in which they can still continue doing their job of either dying to protect you, or, more likely, dying to just try and take some monster down with them. Corpse Conservation is next, and the number of times that I have scrapped a recording of this because I have said Corpse Conversation is absolutely terrifying. Anyways, we don't have the full details of this yet, but we know some of the basics. It supports skills that consume corpses, giving them a chance to take effect without destroying the corpse. So you can then play around with your corpses again, if you had lots of fun the first time. Elemental Focus is next, and this is going all in on damage at the expense of utility, just like the same gem in PathOfExile 1. In fact, it looks like this is almost an exact copy of the PathOfExile 1 gem when it would be about gem level 7. Supported skills deal 25% more elemental damage, but cannot inflict elemental ailments. What I think you might want to do is use this on a finisher that you only really bring out once you've already set off Ice Bite and or Innervate in order to gain those buffs. Then you dunk enemies on the head with Elemental Focus and use that attached to a totally different skill in order to try and deliver a massive devastating blow to that enemy. Enduring Life is next, and this is one we don't have very much details on, but it supports skills that hit enemies directly, causing enemies they kill to grant more Life Blast charges. Okay, so next we have Frozen Vortex, and I think that this is my favorite of the gems that I'm revealing today, even though this was known about by some in the community a little while ago. Frozen Vortex is a support gem that is going to reward you for a big setup. This is not going to do anything if you just randomly throw it into a build. You need to build around it and you need to play around it. If an enemy is shattered, which by default means that you kill a frozen enemy with hit damage, then it is going to do something rather explosive. Except it's going to be a cold explosion. It's going to create a chilling vortex. The magnitude of this killing vortex is going to depend upon the overkill that you put into that hit. So if a monster has 1,000 hit points and you hit it for 1,020 damage, you're going to get a very tiny little vortex on the ground that's only going to do 6 damage per second cold damage. That is reasonably forgettable. However, if you instead hit that monster for 20,000 damage, then you've got 19,000 overkill and your vortex is going to do a staggering 5,700 cold damage per second. So you can see here there's a whole bunch of moving parts that need to go in to make Frozen Vortex good, but if you can pull it off, you are going to get some really lethal, cold, bad stuff on the ground that's going to melt enemies for you. Melt, freeze, whatever a Chilling Vortex does, it's going to absolutely wreck them, and I think that this is going to be a lot of fun to play around with. Whether it's good or not, I'm not clear, but this is definitely going to be fun. Hypothermia is next. I think we said something about having a support gem earlier that is a better version of this. This is going to increase freeze build-up against chilled enemies only. So it's got smaller numbers and it's also more conditional, but it's still something else that you can use to further amplify your freeze build-up. You're never going to use this until you've already got, I think it was Glaciation Support used as well, but if you've already got Glaciation on something else, well, Hypothermia is the next best choice, so you're going to use it then. Knockback is next, and it knocks back enemies. This is something that in PathOfExile 1 is generally considered a meme gem, but might actually be a bit more useful in PathOfExile 2, where enemies can be a little bit more dangerous sometimes. The ability to knock an enemy back will mean that you'll be able to get a little bit of a respite sometimes, and additionally, probably most importantly, you can have knockback on a secondary, tertiary, quaternary skill, and that's not going to be something that's super disruptive to your gem slots on your character like it would be in PathOfExile 1. Lockdown is next, and this plays into the pin mechanic. We don't have full details of how the pin mechanic works, so it's kind of hard to assess this one, but supported skills have up to 120% more pin build-up against nearby enemies, and this is stronger the closer the enemy is to you. So if you're very close to an enemy, you may well be able to inflict the pin condition on it, which I believe, but I'm not 100% certain, is then going to lock them in place but allow them to still act. Searing Flame is next. Those of you who have played PathOfExile 1 may be familiar with Deadly Ailment Support, which undermines the hit damage of a skill but increases the amount of damage over time they can do. Well, Searing Flame is going to be like this, but for Ignite specifically. Supports any skill that hits enemies, causing inflicted ignites to deal more damage, but for its hits to deal less damage. And now we have one of the things that's super niche that would never be used in PathOfExile 1, but in PathOfExile 2 may actually find a little bit of a home, and that is Stormfire Support. This here is a support that supports any skill that hits enemies, prolonging shocks that they inflict on ignited enemies. So this is something that's going to give you a little bit of a reward if you are willing to play around with simultaneously inflicting ignites on some enemies and shocks on others. Then Stormfire is going to be a bit of a payoff for doing that. You're going to want to use this on the skill that is inflicting shock, and you're going to want to use this as your second skill after you have already inflicted an ignite. Once you've got the two of them on there, then you can then use something maybe that's enhanced by Elemental Focus in order to do even more damage again. Bursting Plague is next. This is something that Moxie played around with a couple of days ago. I linked to his playthrough of some of the early acts. This is a very complicated skill. Supports skills that poison enemies, causing poison enemies to gain Plague over time, and then to explode in a Plague Birth upon death. Cannot support the skills of minions. And this is one of those intriguing skills that has apparently played quite well, and that Moxie did recommend using. Iron Grip is next. This is for projectile attacks only, not projectile spells, and it causes strength to increase their projectile damage. We'll have to get exact numbers to assess how good this is, and also we'll need to get a bit of a sense as to how much strength endgame characters typically have. Behead Support is next, and this is coming over from PathOfExile 1, but we don't have full numbers on this, just that it's going to be around. So this supports strike skills. It causes them to steal modifiers from rare monsters they kill, but we don't know the mechanics of it. This was just mentioned in the live stream video, but without full context behind it. Now we have two of the most interesting of the mercenary skills. These were teased quite early on, but they're ones I haven't covered yet. Glacial Bolt loads your crossbow with icy bolts that create 2 walls of ice crystals on impact. It'd be a shame if something were to explode those walls, wouldn't it? And this converts 60% of your physical damage to cold, it knocks back enemies, and it has a lot of freeze build-up on the monsters that it hits. Then we have Explosive Shot, which loads your crossbow with flaming bolts that explode on impact. Oh gee, isn't that convenient? The explosion also detonates any grenades that are in its area of effect. And this also knocks back enemies. So these are 2 things that you can use on your mercenary if you want to maintain range advantage, and also do a lot of damage from range. Fair warning though, Explosive Shot is slow. Attack speed is 70% of baseline. Next we have Blazing Lance, which is something that I kind of should cover, even though it's not going to be in the game on day 1. We're not going to have spears on day 1, so bad luck there if you're hanging out to play with this, but this will be coming in the future, and it has been mentioned at some point in PathOfExile 2 very early in teasers. And finally, we have Corrosion Support. This was announced during the live stream announcement, but I thought it's worth digging a little bit into here because, like so many other things in PathOfExile 2, it takes two quite disparate seeming mechanics and merges them together and rewards you for engaging with both of them. Corrosion Support is going to support any skill that hits enemies, but it's only really useful if that skill applies poison. What it's going to do is cause that poison to apply also to breaking the enemy's armor. This means that you could start out by softening an enemy up with a poison ability, then once you've managed to break its armor, you can then go and smash it with something much heavier hitting. There are a number of skills that work better in conjunction with other skills that strip armor from enemies. On top of that, you could also consider using Corrosion Support as a way to power up the skill that we discussed yesterday that causes those enemy armor fragments to whirl around your character and deal backlash damage to anything that hits you in melee, as well as also providing you with a boost to armor. So there's lots of combo potential for Corrosion Support, which is really interesting. It's something that would not exist in PathOfExile 1. It's something that's quite new, but I quite like this design space. That is Corrosion Support. And ultimately, that is the entirety of teaser season for today. It's entirely possible Grinding Gear Games might decide to surprise us with a very late drop of extra information. If that happens, I'll either make a separate video for it, or alternately, I'll roll it into tomorrow's video. I'm going to leave it there. May your Varlorbs have interesting results.